I'm never really sure where to start because I don't do the kind of work anybody else does. There's like maybe about 60 or 70 of us on the planet who do what I do for a living, which is design digital identity systems, which is a very abstract sort of field. It's like pinning numbers to things and finding ways of using those numbers without revealing anything. And most of the people in my field are still basically stuck 30 years ago with what they think this means. So even in my field, I'm kind of like one of the two odd faces that turn up at conferences, and it's like, oh yeah, they know their stuff. Oh no, we wouldn't pay them to do it. So it's quite a frustrating thing to do. I have a business partner, and we're quite an unusual team because he's a cryptographer, and an ex-physicist. And he's interested in making sure that nobody can break stuff open and see inside it. And I'm interested in making sure that when stuff moves around on networks, no one can spot it moving, which is not a very usual skill set or interest. But it's kind of like being obsessed with Sudokus or something. It's just like you get the bug and you just can't stop wanting to solve this problem. And until a couple of years ago, nobody gave a stuff about our work. I'm going to be polite, and I'm going to try and not use any English crudités when I'm giving this talk, so if I do, please forgive me. Our dear friends at the European Union have gotten a bit of a bugbear in recent years about privacy. But they happen to be bureaucrats and technocrats and people who live in a world of pinning everything down as tightly as possible. So they have given us a raft of legislation, which is not very good legislation, except from the point of view of a legislator. And they have decided that because the rest of the world should follow their same playbook, that they will have such grotesquely horrible punishments for even the slightest violation of these new privacy regulations, that people like Facebook and Google will go, well, we still want to do business in Europe. Oh my God, we're going to have to export European law into our systems. I'm not going to have the political rant about that, because that's not the purpose of this talk. I'm going to have the technology rant about that, which is, this is a stupid idea. GDPR is just fundamentally very broken. But because of its existence, people actually are quite happy to sit in talks that I give now, wearing blankets in a garage, which... I mean, I've had some quite good gigs over the years, but this is going to be up there for a long time. It's going to take a lot to top this one. Right, the whole trouble with privacy and security is that we live in a digital world. Digital data is fundamentally zero cost to copy. I mean, it's a few nanoseconds to copy some registers or a few milliseconds to copy a chunk of a file. But the thing is, it leaves absolutely no evidence it's been copied. Once it's been copied, I can put it onto a USB key and pretend that I'm living in 1990 and it's sneakers and I'm running around with all of the world's data on my encrypted key, and I can pass it on to anybody I like. And there's no way to trace the fact that's happening. Once that data is exfiltrated onto that stick, it's just gone. But it's still absolutely intact, depending on where you get your USB keys from, because obviously a lot of Chinese keys, they turn up, they claim they're a terabyte, and it turns out they're like 4K, and you've probably rewritten the data. That's a very good way of actually scrambling data. If you never want people to get it again, is put it on a device like that, because it will be like a terabyte packed into a 4K cell. But because of this means that in a world where everybody is obsessed with doing transactions online, even though they don't know it, we need some ways in which we can somehow make the data that we deal with safe, for some given value of safe, which is an undefined, unscientific proposition. This stuff will be safe. And GDPR is one particular way of trying to do it. Now, there are entities on this planet who make data very unsafe. I really have to retire this one over here. I mean, Ashley Madison is like 3.5 years ago now. But it still just makes me laugh, the number of government email addresses that were found lurking in its database. It's just like, if you're... Yeah, I'm not in France, I can say this. There's a disproportionate number of French email addresses from French government sites lurking in Ashley Madison. Now, what does this say? Well, I work for the government and I want to arrange cheating. In this case, personal cheating. But it does make you wonder whether you trust those people with other kinds of sites arranging other kinds of cheating. Personally, not. Um, we have over here, they've gone out of fashion as well. I mean, I need something to replace Anonymous with because you just don't hear about them anymore. So I think it might have just been 5 very disgruntled kids who all got hoovered up by the FBI. But I mean, if I was giving this talk 3 or 4 years ago, everybody was petrified that Anonymous was coming for them because every company's got stuff that it's done that it doesn't want to be known about. This is my all-time favorite bad implemented user requirement from a marketing department. I can't actually remember what it's called anymore, but Lenovo shipped a whole range of BIOSes that man in the middle every HTTPS connection. They just did cert swapping. You went down to the BIOS, it went, oh, you're setting up HTTPS. Fine. I'll set up HTTPS for you with a different cert. And then I'll pass sorry, I've got a tunnel back into your code, and you'll get what you think is direct traffic with the remote site. And the reason for it was their marketing department wanted to improve the quality of your ads when you were browsing the internet. So it would look through the ads that were coming into your machine when you were opening up a web connection, and it would go, those aren't the best ads for you. I'm your machine. I know you much better than that. Now, I always joke that were I the programmer in Lenovo who was tasked with doing that, of course I'd write that code. I mean, I'm building a man in the middle into a BIOS. I've got limited memory space to stick it in. I've still got to stick some reasonable amount of cert in there. It's quite funny doing cert swaps anyway, you know, for some given value of funny. And yeah, I'd write that code, and then I would pray to God it never got into production. It would be like, there'll be some, it's a BIOS. They're so bloody buggy anyway. You know, I know we're not supposed to say that in the world of, modern world. We've all got our EFIs now, and they're supposed to be wonderful. But BIOS is a buggy crap. They always have been. And then in the middle, we have... I've decided to represent the entirety of Five Eyes government infrastructure for spying on the entire planet with the people who own a UFO in Gloucestershire. So if you're not aware, we have a genuine UFO in the UK. It's owned by GCHQ. Who are our equivalent of the US NSA, and who have more PhDs in cryptography buried in there on long-term contracts than probably the entire rest of the planet knows exist, because it's what they hoover up. I think these people are a joke. I always did. Hackers who believe that they can be hacktivists are kind of missing the point. They're as much the problem as what they're complaining about. These people over here deserved what happened to them, but the people who run that are horrible pieces of shit. Excuse my language. These are numpties. I don't know if the word numpty has made it out of the UK yet. It hasn't made it to the States. Every time I use it there, nobody gets it. It's a Scottish expression meaning people who are so damn stupid they probably can't get out of bed and tie their shoes in the morning. And that's what these people are. And these people here, unfortunately, are a genuine necessary evil. We honestly do need our governments to be able to spy on live traffic. Because there are some people out there who want to use that live traffic for very horrible reasons. They don't care about your content, by the way. They've just been archiving all the metadata for the internet ever since really it started. They've got a beam splitter down in Cornwall that actually takes splits off the bit in the beam that comes in from the US and just records all US traffic metadata. They've just been doing that ever since, because the metadata, and we'll get onto that in a while, the metadata is what matters. I don't really give a toss about what your content is if I'm them. I don't need to. So, I love giving talks on identity in Europe because you all have legal identities. You all have identity cards across the European continent that you have to actually carry. In most European countries, it's a criminal offence not to be able to produce it, at least within a reasonable period of time. We have no such thing in the UK. These are our supposed identity documents. Does anybody know which of those is likely to be a UK identity document? Okay. Well, most people normally think passports are identity documents, but they're not. They're officially travel documents. You can't actually prove your identity. It just means that you are entitled to walk through a border. I've actually got one of these, a medical card that proves I'm entitled to use NHS services. In the UK, nobody ever checks them anyway, so they're kind of irrelevant. I don't know where mine is. Everybody in the UK has a national insurance number, but there's something like 90 million national insurance numbers currently in use on a working population of 37 million. This down here is an abbreviated form of an actual birth certificate, but this is all anybody ever normally asks you for. You'll notice that there's nothing here to say that I'm alive, or to prove that this ties to any piece of flesh that's walking around in the world. And this over here is actually the only genuine valid identity document. And this is one that I get to put a name in that I want to. This is a deed of change of name. It allows me to change my name in the UK. I put my name, I get someone to witness it, and I can now get a passport. You'll notice that, yet again, nothing biometric. This is the only one that's got a biometric, but this one is anchored off of this or this. And I provide the biometrics as photos when I apply for my passport. In the UK, we don't have legal identity in the sense that anyone else does. Okay. So the system I'm going to describe later on, I'm going to describe a whole pile of problems and areas of interest in solving identity. The system I'm going to describe later is actually designed to capture that UK understanding of identity, which doesn't look like it's particularly computationally tractable at all because there's nothing at the bottom of it. So until about 6 or 7 years ago, everybody who did identity, what they were really interested in was giving you a secure token. And there's still a very big organization called the FIDO Alliance who are trying to get the world to adopt secure tokens. You'd carry your secure token where you wanted to go. Oh, I need to get into that building, secure token. Oh, I need to use this website, secure token and USB key. Right? And the trouble with that is that it doesn't tie to anything. And you can rotate these secure tokens, and then at least you've tied it down in time. But anybody can grab your key fob with your secure token and be you. So it's not a very good solution to the problem. So over the last few years, a whole academic discipline has grown up around something called attributes. These are individual little items of data about a person. And so if you've ever sat in with marketing people who are trying to figure out what is the best onboarding process? What's the essential data we need to capture about a user during onboarding? That's essentially attributes. They're all arguing over what a name means, basically. Attributes are discrete facts. So, dark hair, yes. Wears black, yes. Professional cryptographer, no. So it's not a description of me, that's a description of my business partner. However, that's not a very powerful description, because if you were going to hang around with people who are professional cryptographers, you quickly discover that they all wear black, and until a certain age, they mostly have dark hair. And this is the problem with attributes. They're not actually very defining, unless you have a big set of them. And the bigger the set, well, the more defining, but also the more problems managing it. The thing that academic theorists have great difficulties with is attributes may be absent. There are people who have no hair. Is that an actual value? They have no hair, as in they've chosen to shave it off. Or is it a passive value? They just have no hair. One of those is an active assertion about something, and the other is actually a null value. And the world of identity theoretically hasn't yet developed null value. So Tony Hoare would be very happy. We haven't invented null. Functional programmers would be very happy. You can't have the assertion there is no hair, because that would be a null. That would have to be whatever the appropriate monad value is or something. It's too early in the morning to have that bit of my brain working. But the real trouble with attributes is this problem at the bottom. They are only as trustworthy as where you get them from. See, there's no defining set of information about you that is actually trustworthy, unless somebody trustworthy tells me that that is the information about you. Well, I can use my eyes at present to see that most of you are wearing blankets because you're sensible. And I'm never going to use that phrase again, except maybe at bedtime with my son. Put your blanket on. Be sensible. But all right. So attributes open up an interesting area, though, because What if you have no attributes at all? Well, we have a perfectly reasonable way of dealing with that in human society. We have the concept that somebody is anonymous, that they're unnamed, that no values have been written down about them. Now, anonymity doesn't actually mean what we think it does, because actually, if you're walking down the street, everybody that you don't know is anonymous to you. But you've actually got a whole pile of data you get. It's passive data. You just automatically pick up, oh, so-and-so's face, so-and-so's gait, that sort of stuff. So biometrics don't necessarily fit within the boundary of mustn't have those or it's not anonymous. But it's the actual facts that mustn't be there. So that's me around about 20 years ago. It's impossible to tell it's me around about 20 years ago. That's a very, very useless picture. That's me around about 5 years ago. Still not that useful. Now I've put a date there. I've just set myself down everybody who joined Twitter in August 2007. That's actually quite a small set. It's before it gets into its hyperinflationary growth phase. I'm now, instead of being anonymous, there's nothing you can really say about that. I mean, it's just a blob. Over here, I'm now pseudonymous. I have more or less a sense of being named. And that slowly builds up, because now I can put some traits and I've got some attributes. And then I can put my actual Twitter handle, so you don't even have to go searching for me by date. And then finally, there's my actual name, and now I'm a fully anonymous person. The reason this stuff is important, oops, this is the trouble, this does not like going back. The reason this stuff is important is a lot of people at present are in a movement called the self-sovereign identity movement. These are all people who've eaten too much Bitcoin madness. And they've all gone, the blockchain will allow us to all be fully sovereign on the internet, and nobody will ever know anything about us, and all of our dirty, dodgy Bitcoin transactions are anonymous. No, they are not. There is no anonymity in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is actually this process of pseudonymity, because every time you do a transaction, you end up building up more data about yourself that's actually in a public ledger. It just doesn't look like you are. So it's kind of relevant. Now, I don't normally put arty slides in, so I do apologise. It's too early in the morning to really care. One of the fascinating things about identity is not about names. This rose is a rose, regardless of whether we call it a rose. Its set of traits and properties aren't changing. It's a rose. It might not be a smelling rose. There's quite a lot of varieties of roses deliberately bred so that they don't smell at all for people who are allergic to the smell of flowers. So to them, the idea it would smell as sweet is quite an oxymoron. But naming is something that people who try to do identity spend an awful lot of time getting obsessed about, and it's not actually so helpful. So I've already dissed secure tokens. I love to diss secure tokens, mostly because there's lots of standards for secure tokens, and I can't see that any actual real inventive work has happened since the 1980s on the concept of secure tokens. In fact, I'd probably say no real inventive work has happened on secure tokens since the ancient Akkadians and Sumerians decided that they would give some people particular clay seals and leave them to it. It's because that's really all it is. I have a unique thing, trust me. Okay. I'm a unique person. We all are. Trust me. Yeah. It's easy to rubbish these ideas very easily by just using human analogies. You instantly see, when you put two people there, what's wrong with them. So biometrics, therefore, have become quite popular, because that secure token you might have needs a biometric to say that you're the person the secure token belongs to. And and biometrics look fabulous. You know, thumbprints. Oh, yes. Well, I mean, I do actually activate Apple Pay on my laptop using a fingerprint. Why? Because I make sure my laptop never goes anywhere where somebody else is going to do it. And I always clean my fingerprint sensor off afterwards, because somebody can come along with sellotape, lift it off, put it back on, and be me. Biometrics have holes. Iris scanning and retina scanning. This stuff is quite funny, because, I mean, Samsung had a bit of a problem a few years back when they decided they were going to go to retina scanning for logging into phones. Because it's actually very difficult to get people to use their eyes correctly for a retina scan. That's not how human vision works. Our eyes are moving the entire time. And also, This one's my favourite because this is what we use in courts to try and prove the identity of people who committed crimes in the past. DNA fingerprints. A DNA fingerprint, on average, says there's a 1 in a million chance that another DNA fingerprint from a different individual will match this one. And that sounds quite good. There's a 1 in a million chance of a collision. That's, you know. So in the UK, we've got like a population of somewhere between 65 and 80 million. Nobody's quite sure. But the supermarket said sort of like 10 years ago, there's 72 million people in the country based on how much food gets bought. And the government said, but there's like 63 million people who are known to be in the country. And it's like, well, somewhere between the two is probably the truth. Or it could be 90 odd million. A lot of people just don't eat very well. You know, I mean, it's data, it's always open to interpretation. If you've got a 1 in a million chance of a match, you'd think to yourself, well, that's a very low chance. However, many, many crimes, the majority of murders, for example, are committed by close relatives. So we're moving into territory where actually we might have several candidates, and disambiguating them actually becomes difficult. They might none of them have an alibi, and they might all have hated the relative that's been killed. So these don't carry as much as we'd like. So people have been moving off into other things. Electrocardiograms, quite good fun. That's Apple are now doing stuff in watches with them. Electroencephalograms is brilliant. You can get these Bluetooth headsets in Japan that pair a little pair of dog or cat ears with a little Bluetooth tail. So for all the people in the otherkin movement, you know, and it picks up their encephalogram and then it will operate the tail according to their mood. I'm not sure I want people to see my tail wagging. You know, my moments of evil genius need to be kept private. So you can marry together these two ideas of secure tokens and biometrics into another piece of technology that also doesn't work the way that people think it does and isn't as trustworthy as people would like it to be, and that's ID cards. So we have no mandatory ID card in the UK. But the government has been trying for years to convince people that they should have some kind of proof of age card, because we have a whole pile of you must prove your age regulations. Supermarkets insist that if you look under 25, they'd like you to carry some ID to make sure you are over 18. And that sounds kind of silly, but my other half used to regularly be able to get on buses and pretend that she was under 16, right up until she was about 35. So, and in London, if you're under 16, you get free bus travel. So for basically, until she got twice the normal allowance. Now, you could say, well, that's bad because she just cheated the system because it's age-based. But actually, no, it's appearance of age-based, actually, and therefore she's very lucky. She got a double allotment. I didn't get a double allotment. So, this thing is obviously, once you've invented it and you're starting to use it, is now a place that people are going to attack to try and come up with ways of getting past it. And so, as a result, there's lots of complicated technology, lots of physical security features all built into this, you know, all of this. But is that actually where we attack? Is that where I'm going to attack if I want to use an ID card illicitly? No. I'm not going to attack the card. I'm not going to attack the system. I'm going to attack the person I'm using the card with. I'm going to social engineer around. So I've actually, the only photo ID I've got is my passport. I sometimes have to go places where I'm supposed to show my passport, because in the world of digital identity, there's this obsession with everybody proving their identity, understandably. So I don't carry my passport unless I'm travelling. And by that, I specifically mean travelling outside the UK. So that happens like 5 or 6 times a year. And apart from that, my passport is locked away, and I'm not showing it to anybody. I don't have to. I'm not legally obliged. Not happening. So I use my Twitter feed. Now, I have been into secure facilities that are locked down so that you have to use a passport ID to get in because they print passports. One of the most secure facilities in the civilian space in the UK. And I have been in there with my Twitter feed as my way of getting in. Why? Because nobody has yet taught anybody who does security on a building like that how to not accept a Twitter feed as identity. It's got my face on it. It's got 10,500 tweets. It's my personal feed. So as you could imagine, That isn't work-safe content. That's random ranting about the world. And I have very successfully gotten into half a dozen different places this way by holding up my Twitter feed, having looked harassed and perplexed. Oh, photo ID. I didn't know about that. Oh, flustered, into the bag. Out comes the Twitter feed. I show that and I say, oh, and nobody would want to claim this feed. And every single time it's been like, oh yeah, in you go then. Now, now that's not going to work at border control. I'm not going to be able to not use a passport but use my Twitter feed. At least I'm not sure I've necessarily got the nerve to try it, because that's one of those places where the consequences would be bad if it goes wrong. But there are some interesting examples that you can find on YouTube of from Black Hat Talks, etc., where people have found ways around various parts of the security of airports, etc., through social engineering with inappropriate identities. You know, because the point is, it's always the human that you attack. It's always the data inflow or the human. It's never the token. It's never this thing. I mean, if somebody shows me this, I have no way to check whether the UV image is correctly printed. I probably don't have the equipment to read whatever's going out on their MyFair antenna, because they're probably using a secure chip that's got a specialist secure reader, because they know that the reader could be attacked. So they've made that special equipment. So electronic passports, the new e-passports, they're only actually readable with a particular reader called Golden Reader. And these cost £4,000 a pop. And there's only one company that makes them. And funnily enough, there's quite a few places in the world that have borders that you'd think would have bought one that haven't. That's not my bugbear, it's my business partner's bugbear. We were going through, travelling through to Brussels on the Eurostar, and you get to the French border and you have to prove your identity. And I whizzed through this as quickly as possible because I hate queues and passport booths and all of that. He disappears for 20 minutes. And then I think, what's he done? Because it's always the worry with the cryptographer. What the hell has he done? You know, made an inappropriate bomb joke in the queue again, because he's done that before. And obviously, that's from an English perspective of an inappropriate bomb joke in a queue, not from everybody else's. I mean, we all think that. Every English person going through a passport or security check goes, I could have a bomb in my shoe. It's the first thought that springs to mind, because, you know, it's kind of like, well, I could. You know. He comes out after about 20 minutes with it from this little door around the back that was almost invisible, with this chap, and they're laughing and joking, and he's slapping this chap on the back, and this chap's slapping him on the back. He comes over, and I said, what the hell were you doing? And he said, oh, I was just explaining to them how that bit of kit that they were using at the thing, how that doesn't work properly with the other bit of kit that they've got at the back. What other bit of kit? Weren't you paying attention? No, it's a bloody passport control. I want to be through it as quick as possible. He said, oh, well, it turns out they've found this out themselves. They have no end of problems, and they can't get anybody to buy them a new reader. Okay, they're one of the major points of entry to the mainland Europe from the UK, but they're not willing to spend £4,000 on the right reader to go with the bit of kit at the back that it's talking to. It's like, okay, fair enough. So that's not the stuff that people would attack. It's the person that you attack. Now, that's not to say there aren't some clever buggers out there who, as we move into a world of live data, aren't looking at this as a great opportunity. Because if I've got an ID card, that's something I need specialist equipment to deal with. But if I'm dealing with something that's deciding to use cameras and deciding to use Bluetooth and deciding to use a network to pick up data from me, funnily enough, that just moved into my sphere of experience and cheap kit. I can carry around a little netbook or whatever, and I can play with all of those things. So, liveness is a very fascinating problem. How the hell do you know that if you decide to take a face over the internet as a proof of who somebody is, that it's actually coming from a person, not from a photograph? Because of the first facial recognition systems, boom, up goes a photo, boom, you're in. And this has become a very interesting thing over the last couple of years, because so the system I'm going to describe in a while, it was designed for a client that we wanted to prove people were over 18 anonymously on the internet. And The way to do that is actually to have some kind of biometric proof that you can put together with some kind of very short-lived token. And so we went for faces, because faces and phones, very easy. But you have to be quite careful about this, because a few years back, someone discovered that you could build 3D models of people's faces off of photographs. And most of the software that's actually detecting from the video there, if you point another phone at it with the face on, will quite happily detect the face. My phone all the time, if I've got the camera on, is trying to detect faces all over the place. It's amazing what it sees as faces. So it's you know, but if you can get data through that roughly matches how face recognition systems look at faces, then boom, you're straight in. Now, what all of identity is really about, and what all of e-commerce is about, even though nobody thinks about it, is actually the arbitration of trust. That is, we have somebody that we need to trust. We need them to prove to us via somebody that we already do trust that they are who they are. And then we need somebody else that we trust to give us the money that they say they've got to deliver the money up. And it used to be that if you wanted to do trust, you could only really use banks as backends for trust, and you've got the Visa network, you've got Swift and all the other things. And those are all trust networks. And then you have, somewhat lower down the ladder, you have Western Union, who at one point in history were very trusted because pieces of paper being written off of telegraph wires were very trusted for a while because all the telegraphy operators were known. But in the modern world, their systems are one of the greatest, easiest ways to get other people's money into your bank account criminally, fraudulently. So there's a whole pile of theory around trust arbitration. I'm not really in the mood for talking about it this morning. But there's the idea that you can basically hive off something that will be paid out when conditions are met. And there's also the idea that somewhere you have some kind of root of trust. And the most things that governments and banks talk about are a root of trust, a certificate chain, which your browser's all full of certificate chains, some of which are much better than others. That your hardware should have some kind of trusted element. So there's a little HSM that lives inside your iPhone or inside some of your Android devices that can do all of the crypto operations without anything outside it being able to see them. And then signing, the idea that we can put some zero-knowledge proof onto something, that when we get that thing, we can calculate that proof ourselves off of what we receive, compare it to the proof that we've been given and go, that matches, and then compare that to another proof, if it's done right, that confirms that that proof couldn't have been given to us fallaciously. Basically, it's all turtles all the way down. This is the trouble with all of this. The main thing about this is it's all about contract formation. In the UK, of course, we have a very ropey view of identity, and we also have a somewhat idiosyncratic view of what a contract is. And we share this with the other common law nations like the US, Canada, etc. Basically, they borrowed our way of doing it rather than the way that developed in Germany and France in the Middle Ages. They both have their roots in how the Romans did it, and the Romans had very weird commercial law. To be able to produce two diametrically opposed systems of looking at what contract is out of effectively the same root means you've got quite a complex thing to start with. This up here, this in the UK is a contract. There's nothing written down. There's nothing said. There's an exchange of money for something. That very active exchange between two people and the intent to do business that sits behind it, the two main planks of a contract in UK law. There's a third one, but I can never remember it, and it's not the thing that people sue each other over. This down here looks like a contract, and if you're in Germany and you're using your legally mandated German signature, this is a contract. In the UK, this is merely evidence that a contract has already occurred. Which is it doesn't sound like a major difference, but actually it's a huge difference in how a whole body of law then grows out of this. Because in the UK, I've had to sue a couple of people over the years for broken verbal contracts. And you think to yourself, well, how do you prove what the terms of the contract were? Well, you go to a court, and the court then says, what would be reasonable? Which is a bit of a loaded gun to both parties' heads. So both parties actually have an incentive to try and solve this before it gets to court, because you can't quite know which way it's going to go. Whereas I've had some bad experiences with some German companies, which is why I use the German example, where contracts can be somewhat difficult to get paid on at times, especially if you're a UK supplier and you're, well, a non-German supplier. What's implicit in this up here is something else that you can't see. There is an exchange of identity going on. It's impossible to form a contract without exchanging identity in some form. Unless it's impossible for me to know who I've just entered into a contract with, and then I can't have had an intent to do business, and there can't be a contract. So in UK law, there's always an exchange of identity when you have a contract. In Napoleonic code style systems, there's also always an exchange of identity when you enter into a contract, because you've got an actual proof of the contract itself. So we can record proofs over time that contracts have happened, and we can build up histories with particular individuals, and out of those actually comes trust. Trust actually is a contractual thing. It's something that builds up over time. If I meet you for the first time and I decide I'm going to buy some socks off you, for example, I don't need a lot of trust, because I can probably see the socks. But if I've bought 100 sets of socks off you over the course of a year, and you start up a website and you don't even show pictures of the socks, you just say you have those particular socks with a barcode, maybe, for the socks that you sell in the shop. If I've had 100 transactions with you, I'm probably going to trust you, because we've got this history of I actually get socks. If I then don't get socks through the post, then I probably don't trust you so much anymore. But it's probably not expensive enough to be worth suing you over. So we have ways of actually capturing some of this stuff in machines that we can actually use to produce proofs ourselves. And we've got a simple toolkit. Our crypto tool bag is the idea of a secure message catalog, which is something that I can produce off of a message, and it's a hash value, but it's a hash value that uses an encryption key. So even with a really weak hash, it's still a very strong proof that the content of the message is the same as it was when I sent it to you. It's very hard to get a collision. This over here is public-private cryptography, which is a weak form of cryptography, but useful for moving pieces of data that have no internal structure, i.e. keys, because keys are supposed to be random. And this is actually what we use for passing most actual data around in most crypto systems, which is symmetric cryptography, where we both have the same key. It's very powerful in terms of its bit strength. For a very small number of bits, I can get a very high level of randomness. But at the same time, we both have to have a copy of that key. This is also many orders of magnitude faster than that, because these keys are like 16 bytes. And at present, I'm not using keys lower than about 2048 bytes for my public-private crypto. So it's... And if you're using AES, most modern processors actually can do an AES round in one processor instruction. So this stuff is incredibly cheap. This is the only tool bag you need to do absolutely everything else I'm going to describe going forwards. And now I'm going to have to speed up, because I'm well past my time slot. I've got 3 minutes to give a whole pile of stuff. Finally, you have to understand a very small amount of cryptography. So this is the idea of how to put this. So one-time pads are where I assign a unique number to a piece of information. And I only ever use that unique number when I want to transmit that piece of information. The piece of information itself doesn't travel. Both sides have to have access to the book of unique numbers. And this was sort of developed, in the 18th and the 19th century as a way of doing military cryptography, and it was formalized by Shannon in 1947, because Claude Shannon was he's responsible for most of the really useful stuff in information science, basically. His theorem was that as long as you never actually use a different number to describe a piece of information, it will be difficult for people to actually break the piece of information, and there's a mathematical proof of that. But it doesn't actually work in the internet age very well, because he didn't take into account that I can keep spotting the same number going past, which is actually quite a useful thing to be able to do. Immutability is something our functional programming friends love. All functional programming languages are obsessed with immutable data structures. Immutability is also the basis on which blockchains are built. And it's nothing more complex than the fact that A, we've got singly linked lists, so I can't tamper with things behind me. And B, I can put in calculated values at various points as I'm building up structures that tell me what's beneath. And if what's beneath doesn't reproduce that number, I know it's been tampered with. Obviously, the places to attack if I'm nasty are the calculation of that number so it looks like it's the right number, or ways of perverting what's lurking back further down the things. But things like public blockchains, distributed ledgers, are all about using these two techniques, a Merkle tree as it's called, to basically put stuff in public that proves that things have happened. And I'm not going to talk about blockchain. I'm not going to talk about routing. Tor is a very much liked tool by a lot of people, but I don't trust it. It's all I'm going to say on that. So I'm going to be really, really quick. So we designed this this system. All of the stuff that's in from this section onwards is all patented bar one slide, which is why I can talk about it. It's the only slide deck in the world that will tell you how to build end-to-end an identity system, because everything else is proprietary and hidden away. But because it's in patents, it's all in the public domain. You have to pay the people who own the patents if you want to implement it, but I mean, but you can learn how to implement just from the fact it exists. So firstly, these are our principles for doing it. We wanted to be able to do common law over the internet, for reasons that I won't go into. We wanted to actually have genuine anonymity. We wanted to make it very, very difficult to do mass surveillance. I don't care if you are a criminal and somebody can prove that you appear to be a criminal and they want to do surveillance on just you, I'm fine with that. We have legal systems that already allow for that. We have wiretaps and all of that. But I don't want somebody to be able to come up to the database and say, let's find all the people who have blue hair. Let's find all the people who've ever had lunch on a Thursday at a certain restaurant. That's not what I want to allow. Because the former is acceptable for law enforcement. The latter is not acceptable for law enforcement and will be abused very quickly. And we wanted this thing to be able to scale, and we wanted it to be very lightweight. This stuff isn't very interesting. This is how do I register myself, and we anchor on passports, and that's dull. And how do I then do something? And this down here looks like a really awful bit of diagram, but there's something quite fundamental in there I'm going to get onto in a sec, so we're going to skip past that. This is the heart of the system that we designed for this particular problem. And this is best visualized as two people who decide that they're about to. One is going to buy socks, and the other is going to sell socks. To buy socks, I have to give you something. You don't have to give me anything at this point, because you haven't got any proof that what I've given you is worth socks. Having something, though, you need to ask somebody, is this worth socks? So you go off to a third party and you say, hi, can you tell me whether or not this is worth socks? But neither party want that third party to know whether it's actually worth socks. What you want is that third party to give you information from which you can calculate for yourself if it's worth socks. Right? Because otherwise you're putting a lot of trust in this entity to keep books straight, which you don't really want. And then this entity says, well, I don't know if it's actually worth socks, but here's some information about socks. Oh, and by the way, here's some information about the person you're trying to buy socks from, and just hands it straight out. The thing about it is, this is not a client-server interaction at all. Most identity systems try and be client-server. This is literally one UDP packet, two UDP packets, three UDP packets. The reason it's designed that way is because this is going to travel over networks. This is traffic that you can see. If I'm doing client servers all over the place, I can have somebody stand as a man in the middle and see all the stuff I'm sending up to the server and all the responses going back, and now they can quite happily coordinate them. And this is the basis of a technique called flow analysis or traffic analysis. This is the stuff that Bletchley Park did in the Second World War that broke the German military machine. It wasn't Enigma telling you what a general was having for breakfast. It was actually being able to know in real time what all the radio traffic of Europe was showing movement, was showing density of noise. And that's why I said earlier on, GCHQ, they're interested in all the metadata. They don't give stuff about the content. The content can always be rediscovered by correlating moments in time that have been recorded with real-world stuff that comes in. You know, it's the index. It's like having a database. What actually matters with the database most of the time is the index for the quick query, not the content of the database, which you can assume is living on a block somewhere. Okay, so it's two sides of the same problem. The big problem with a system like this, oops, now I shouldn't have to pull, you should just let me tap. So the big problem with a system like this is if I was using those attributes I described earlier, and somebody's asking for a query about, say, your age or your date of birth, that's a very small piece of data. And because it's a very small piece of data, that's going to be relatively easy to crack crypto on. You don't want to encrypt small things, you want to encrypt big things. Bigger things are more difficult to break, especially if their internal structure is not definite. So as a result, oops, skip, oh. Serious Apple fail. As a result, we decided that what's actually interesting is blocks of data. Think web forms. Effectively, we built a system in which we decided to patent a web form. It's amazing what you can get patented successfully in California. It really is. I mean, it's just that it's a hilarious process. As a result of this, we ended up with somewhat different data going around. But the only thing that really mattered was a link to a photo, because the photo is what you've the photo allows you to match what you see against the face that you're seeing in front of you. That's the proof that who you're dealing with is a very good likelihood of being the person you think you're dealing with. We put a confidence system behind it, which basically allows you to say we're 70% confident this data is true, and and you can build that up and down over time. It's not very interesting, but what is interesting is essentially we came up with a new way of doing blockchains. It's not really a blockchain, it's an entirely new block architecture that's basically lots of overlapping blockchains that are very fine-grained and very cheap to calculate. And to do this, we have this shared receipt. Both parties have some of the information shared. And most interestingly, they share a key. And that key is actually we treat that as a transaction ID. It's just a really big random number. But both of them can open up either of these two receipts, and these two receipts contain complementary data. I get the data about you, you get the data about me. And either of us can then use our half of the receipt to go into that blockchain and open the other half of the receipt to prove what we sent. See, it's all well and good being able to prove in court what you received, but sometimes you have to be able to prove what you sent because somebody is disputing what you sent. And so this allows you to do the inverse case. But also, we wanted to give a little bit of ability to look back in history. All of this lives in a centrally encrypted structure. So all of this is encrypted with that transaction key in a central repository. But we allow you to actually see how to find another one of these records, the previous one that each party did, in the structure, but with no keys to be able to read it. That's no use to you as an individual. But if somebody is committing a lot of fraud and the police are getting a lot of these in, then they can start to say, well, we can see this, we can see this, we can see this, we can correlate this with this and this. So effectively, it's like having a wiretap in a private space, which is a really weird concept. It's very hard to get your head around. And you end up with this sort of structure that looks like this between two people. But each of these up here acts like one of those between all the other people that they deal with. So you end up with this massive mesh that can't be tampered with. Get a couple of million transactions in there and there's no way to tamper with it because it's cross-correlated so many different ways and you don't control any of the things it's cross-correlated with. So all the other numbers scream, you cheated. Which by and of itself is enough to say, well, this person we don't know what they've cheated about, but it's enough to prove that they've cheated, which by and of itself shows bad intent. We had to use facial recognition because of the particular problem we're trying to solve. And facial recognition itself, actually it turns out it's a relatively trivial thing to roll your own using a little technique called local binary patterns. And this is within 1 or 2% of the same confidence level that professional face recognition software like Cognitech that's used on passport gates can achieve. Only it does it much, much faster and doesn't involve having to pay them a license for the number of faces you want in the database at any one time. Because if you want millions of users, you don't want to pay a license for each user out of the millions, especially not if you decide that you're going to allow them to change their face relatively regularly to keep them up to date. I'm not going to go into that because that's the bit that wasn't our work. We got in a friend who's very, very good at that sort of stuff. But this is the thing that's interesting to me, is the biometric liveness, proving that biometric came from a real live device and proving it came from a real person. So your blink response is a fixed function. It'll vary a little bit if you're stoned or if you're drunk. But the actual response curve itself always follows effectively the same character. And it was suggested we could use the blink response itself just as a proof of liveness. Well, you can't, because it's one discrete piece of data and it could be faked. But what can't be faked so easily is if you send out parameters to describe 2 points in time at which that blink response is going to be triggered. And then you can use a fixed function at your back end to actually say, is the curve right? Is the combination of curves right? So we effectively used an eyeball as a way of putting a timing mechanism into the device. And we put this lovely little I've forgotten what they call them, elliptic curve. An elliptic curve that actually sits in your device. It's a shared secret. And we get you to follow a piece of text around the screen, because eyes have this horrible habit of just naturally following text as it moves. And we can use 3 or 4 points off the screen to effectively be 3 or 4 points off an elliptic curve. So we can instantly say, did that device have the right signature, the right key in it? Does it got the right curve? So we've now tied down the blink to both you, almost finished, tied down the blink to both you and to a device that's allowed in at a physical point in time. Using that, we're then able to do some fairly clever stuff that means we can actually prove your device is live on the network as the device it should be, over the network segment it should be. And so we've got a biometric proof of liveness for both you, the device, and the network, all 3 of them out of one blink, well, one pair of blinks, which is kind of neat. And finally, there's a man in the middle attack that tends to turn up in web that we had to solve as part of this. So this effectively allows you to have a logout button for other people's web pages. It just happens to be a funny thing, and it's patented, which is kind of like weird. So I'm not going to go into asset tracking. So anyway, if anybody has any questions about identity, come and bug me later. I'll be lurking around looking shell-shocked and things for days. I drank too much last night. And thank you very much for your time, and I'm glad you had blankets, because it's actually starting to feel a bit nippy in here. So